In a grand old mansion, a family hides a deadly secret. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed old lady with a knack for noticing things, arrives for a fancy engagement party. But whispers of a lost box, a threatening letter, and a shady past pull her into a mystery. As tensions rise, she uncovers a web of lies tied to smuggling, blackmail, and a long-ago death. With her quiet ways and clever mind, Miss Marple digs up the truth, forcing the Ashfords to face their darkest fears. Will their name survive, or will the past destroy them? Join Miss Marple as she unravels a secret that changes everything. Chapter 1. An Invitation to Ashford Hall. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in shades of gold and orange. Leaves swirled gently outside Miss Jane Marple's small, cosy cottage, where she sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly. A half-finished pink scarf lay in her lap, the soft wool slipping through her fingers as she worked. The rhythm of her knitting was steady, almost like a heartbeat, and it gave her mind space to wander. At 72, Miss Marple's hands were still nimble, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, and her thoughts sharper still. She had a knack for noticing things, small things, like the way a neighbour's curtains twitched, or the hesitation in a voice. Those little details often told bigger stories. The quiet of the morning was broken by the crunch of gravel outside. Miss Marple glanced up as the postman, young Tom Bailey, pedalled up the path on his bicycle. He was a cheerful boy, always whistling, though today his tune was a bit off-key. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called, slipping an envelope through the letter slot. "Fancy one today. Looks important." "Thank you, Tom," she replied, her voice soft but clear. She set her knitting aside and crossed the room to pick up the letter. The envelope was thick, creamy paper, not the usual thin sort from the village. It bore an embossed crest, a lion and a rose entwined, the mark of the Ashford family. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. The Ashfords were no ordinary family. They lived at Ashford Hall, a grand old mansion 10 miles outside St. Mary, Mead, and their name carried weight in the county. Wealthy, respected, and private, they rarely mixed with the village folk, though gossip about them trickled through tea-shops and church pews. She opened the envelope with care, unfolding a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was elegant, the ink a deep blue. It was from Lady Beatrice Ashford, the matriarch of the family. Miss Marple's lips curved into a small smile as she read, "Dear Miss Marple, I hope this finds you well. You may not recall, but we met briefly at the St. Mary's Charity Bazaar 2 summers ago. Your wisdom left an impression. I am writing to invite you to Ashford Hall for a weekend gathering to celebrate my son Edward's engagement to Miss Clara Wentworth. Your presence would be most reassuring, dear Jane, in these delicate times. We expect you Friday afternoon. If it suits, a car will be sent. Yours sincerely, Beatrice Ashford." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the letter resting in her lap. "Delicate times," she murmured. The phrase stuck out like a crooked stitch in her knitting. Why would Lady Beatrice, a woman known for her poise, use such words? And why invite her, a spinster from St. Mary Mead, with no grand title or fortune? True, they had met at the bazaar. Miss Marple recalled Beatrice's warm smile and nervous fingers twisting a handkerchief as they chatted about roses. But this invitation felt like more than politeness. It felt like a plea. She rose and crossed to the window, gazing at the garden where her dahlias bloomed in tidy rows. The Ashfords were a puzzle. Village talk painted them as perfect. But perfection, Miss Marple knew, was often a mask. There were whispers of old scandals. Something about Lord Reginald Ashford, Beatrice's late husband, and his sudden death in a boating accident 10 years ago. Some said his business dealings weren't as clean as his charity work suggested. Others mentioned family tensions, especially between Edward and his younger sister Margaret, who had a sharp tongue and a sharper temper. And then there was their cousin, Leonard, an artist who lived at the Hall but never seemed to belong. Miss Marple's mind worked like her knitting, loop by loop, building something whole from small threads. She didn't know the full story yet, but she sensed a tangle waiting to be unravelled. Well, she said to herself, a weekend at Ashford Hall might be just the thing. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, already planning what to pack. By Friday morning, Miss Marple was ready. Her suitcase held 2 modest dresses, a warm cardigan, her knitting, and a small notebook she always carried. She wore her best hat, a neat grey one with a single feather, and stood at the gate as a sleek black car pulled up. The driver, a young man with a stiff collar and a serious face, tipped his cap. Miss Marple, I'm from Ashford Hall. Name's Robert. Thank you, Robert, she said, settling into the back seat. The car smelled of leather and polish, a world away from the dusty lanes of St. Mary Mead. As they drove, Miss Marple watched the countryside roll by. Fields of sheep, stone walls, and the occasional cottage with smoke curling from its chimney. Robert was quiet, but she caught his glance in the rearview mirror, a flicker of curiosity. "Do you enjoy working for the Ashfords, Robert?" she asked, her tone light. He hesitated, then nodded. "It's good work, ma'am. They're fair. But—" He trailed off, gripping the wheel a bit tighter. "But?" Miss Marple prompted, her voice gentle as a breeze. "Oh, nothing," he said quickly. "Just a big house, lots of goings-on." His words were clipped, and he didn't meet her eyes again. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Even servants, she knew, could hold pieces of a puzzle. The car turned onto a long tree-lined drive, and Ashford Hall came into view. It was a grand sight. Tall windows, ivy creeping up grey stone walls, and a fountain bubbling in the courtyard. The house seemed to watch her as she stepped out, its windows like eyes holding secrets. Robert carried her suitcase to the door, where a maid in a crisp apron greeted her. "Welcome, Miss Marple," the maid said, her voice polite but hurried. "I'm Elsie. Lady Beatrice is waiting in the drawing-room." Miss Marple followed Elsie through a marble hall, past portraits of stern-faced men and women in old-fashioned clothes. The air smelled of beeswax and roses, and every surface gleamed. Yet there was a stillness, a heaviness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Elsie knocked on a heavy oak door and ushered her inside. Lady Beatrice Ashford rose from a velvet sofa, her silver hair swept into an elegant bun. She was in her 60s, with a face that was still beautiful, but lined with worry. Her blue eyes lit up as she crossed the room, her hands outstretched. "Jane, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice warm but tinged with strain. "I hope the journey wasn't too tiring." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, taking Beatrice's hands. They were cold, despite the fire crackling in the hearth. It's a pleasure to be here." Beatrice gestured to a chair, and they sat. The drawing-room was grand, with tall ceilings, silk curtains, and a chandelier that sparkled like stars. A tea-tray sat on a low table, steam rising from a silver pot. Beatrice poured 2 cups, her movements careful but shaky. "I'm so glad you could join us," she said. "This engagement is a happy time, but families, you know, can be complicated." Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. "Families often are," she said, her tone kind but her eyes watchful. Beatrice's words were like the letter, polished but with something hidden beneath. "Tell me about Edward and Clara," she added, steering the conversation gently. Beatrice's smile softened. "Edward is my pride, 28 now, so steady and kind. Clara Wentworth is his fiancée, a lovely girl from London. Her family's wealth is new, mind you, but she has grace." Her voice faltered, and she glanced at the fire. "Margaret, my daughter, is less enthusiastic about the match." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, does Margaret not care for Clara?" Beatrice hesitated, then laughed lightly. "Oh, Margaret's just protective. She's 24, full of spirit. You'll meet her at dinner, and Leonard, our cousin, is here too. He's an artist, a bit unconventional." Her words were quick, as if she wanted to move past the topic. Before Miss Marple could ask more, the door swung open, and a young woman stormed in. She had dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that flashed with annoyance. "Mother, the flowers are all wrong," she snapped, then stopped, noticing Miss Marple. "Oh, I didn't know we had company." Beatrice's face tightened, but she smiled. "Margaret, this is Miss Jane Marple, our guest. Jane, my daughter, Margaret." Margaret's gaze flicked over Miss Marple, taking in her plain dress and knitting bag. "Charmed," she said, her tone cool. "Mother, the florist sent lilies instead of roses. It's a disaster for the engagement party." "We'll fix it, dear," Beatrice said, her voice soothing but strained. "Why don't you join us for tea?" Margaret shook her head. "I've got to sort this out." She left as quickly as she'd come, the door clicking shut behind her. Beatrice sighed. "She's spirited, as I said. Please don't mind her." Miss Marple smiled. "Not at all. Young people have so much energy." But her mind was already turning. Margaret's sharpness wasn't just about flowers. There was anger there, and maybe fear. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the silence settle. Moment later, a young man entered, tall and handsome, with fair hair and a polite smile. "Mother, He stopped, seeing Miss Marple. "Oh, I beg your pardon." "Edward, come in," Beatrice said, her face brightening. "This is Miss Marple, our guest. Jane, my son, Edward." Edward bowed slightly. "A pleasure, Miss Marple. Mother speaks highly of you." His voice was warm, but his eyes held a shadow, a flicker of worry that didn't match his smile. "Thank you, Edward," Miss Marple said. "I hear congratulations are in order." He blushed, a boyish grin breaking through. "Yes, Clara's wonderful. You'll meet her tonight." He glanced at his mother, then added, "I should check on the arrangements. Excuse me." He left, his steps quick but heavy. Beatrice watched him go, her hands twisting in her lap. "He's so happy," she said, almost to herself. "I want this weekend to be perfect for him." Miss Marple nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Edward's warmth felt genuine, but that shadow in his eyes told a different story. And Beatrice's nervousness, Margaret's temper, the grand house with its watchful air, it all added up to something. She didn't know what yet, but she would. As the afternoon faded, Elsie showed Miss Marple to her room, a cosy space with a 4-poster bed and a view of the gardens. Miss Marple unpacked her knitting and sat by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn. A man stood near the rose bushes, sketching in a notebook. He was thin, with dark hair and a hunched posture. Leonard, she guessed. He looked up, as if sensing her gaze, and their eyes met for a moment before he turned away. Dinner was at 7, and Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a simple grey dress that made her look unassuming. She knew people often spoke freely around someone they thought was just a sweet old lady. Downstairs, the dining room was a blaze of candlelight and crystal. The table was set for 6, with Beatrice at the head, Edward and Clara on one side, Margaret and Leonard on the other, and Miss Marple across from Beatrice. Clara Wentworth was a surprise. She was young, perhaps 22, with golden hair and a smile that lit the room. But her eyes, like Edward's, held a trace of unease. "Miss Marple, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "Edward says you're very wise." "Oh, I just noticed things," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You must be excited about the engagement." Clara's cheeks pinked, but her smile wavered. "Very much," she said, glancing at Edward. He squeezed her hand, but his jaw tightened. Margaret, sitting across from Clara, rolled her eyes. "It's all anyone talks about," she said, her voice sharp. "Engagements, flowers, dresses. You'd think the world stopped turning." "Margaret," Beatrice said softly, a warning in her tone. Leonard, beside Margaret, said nothing, his fork pushing, food around his plate. His dark eyes flicked up, watching everyone, then dropped back to his plate. Miss Marple noticed his fingers, stained with charcoal, and the way he avoided Clara's gaze. The meal was delicious. Roast lamb, buttered potatoes, and peas so fresh they popped in the mouth. But the air was heavy. Beatrice tried to keep the conversation light, asking Miss Marple about St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple answered cheerfully, but her eyes never stopped moving. She saw Margaret's scowl, Edward's tensed shoulders, Clara's forced smile and Leonard's silence, and Beatrice trying so hard to hold it all together. As dessert was served, apple tart with cream, Miss Marple spoke up. "This house is beautiful, Beatrice. So many stories in these walls, I imagine." Beatrice's spoon paused. "Oh, yes. The Ashfords have lived here for generations. It's a legacy we cherish." Her voice was steady, but her eyes darted to Edward, then away. "Legacies can be heavy," Miss Marple said lightly, as if chatting about the weather. "All those expectations." Margaret snorted. "Too right. Some people think they're owed everything just because of a name." Her gaze flicked to Clara, who paled. "Margaret, that's enough," Edward said, his voice low but firm. The table fell silent. Leonard's fork clinked against his plate, the only sound. Miss Marple sipped her water, her mind racing. There was a crack in the Ashford family, and it was wider than she'd thought. After dinner, Beatrice suggested coffee in the drawing room, but Miss Marple excused herself, claiming tiredness. In truth, She wanted to think. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand on the polished banister, her mind piecing together the evening. Margaret's bitterness, Edward's worry, Clara's unease, Leonard's silence, and Beatrice's desperate calm. It was a puzzle, and she was only at the edges. In her room, she sat by the window, her knitting in her lap. The moon hung low over Ashford Hall, casting silver light on the gardens. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight, and she knew this grand house was no different. Something was wrong here, something deeper than a family spat. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and sharp eyes, was determined to find it. As she picked up her needles, a faint sound reached her, a creak like a floorboard under careful steps. She paused, listening. The sound came from the hall, then stopped. Someone was moving in the night, someone who didn't want to be heard. Miss Marple's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. The puzzle was growing, and she was ready to unravel it, stitch by stitch. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Miss Jane Marple's guest room at Ashford Hall, casting soft shadows on the polished floor. She woke early, as she always did, her mind already turning over the events of the previous evening. The dinner had been a study in contrasts, Lady Beatrice's forced cheer, Margaret's sharp words, Edward's quiet tension, Clara's uneasy smile, and Leonard's brooding silence. Each of them, Miss Marple thought, was like a thread in a tangled skein, and she was determined to find where they knotted. She dressed in a simple blue frock, pinned her grey hat with the single feather, and tucked her knitting into a small bag. The house was quiet as she stepped into the hall, the only sound the faint ticking of a grandfather clock downstairs. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves held secrets they weren't ready to share. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a small smile. She had seen houses like this before, grand and proud, but hiding cracks beneath their polish. Downstairs, the dining room was empty except for Elsie, the maid, who was setting out a breakfast of toast, jam, and steaming tea. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Elsie said, her voice bright but her eyes darting to the door. "The family's not down yet. They're not early risers, most of them." "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "It's a lovely morning. Do you enjoy working here?" Elsie hesitated, her hands smoothing her apron. "It's a good place, ma'am. The Ashfords pay well, but it's busy, you know. Always something going on." She glanced at the door again, then hurried off to the kitchen. Miss Marple spread jam on her toast, her mind noting Elsie's nervousness. Servants, she knew, saw more than they let on. In St. Mary Mead, her own maid, Cherry, often brought tidbits of gossip that turned out to be vital clues. Elsie's quick glances and vague words suggested she knew something. Maybe not the whole story, but a piece of it. As she sipped her tea, Edward entered, his fair hair neatly combed, but his face tired, as if he hadn't slept well. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, offering a polite smile. "I hope you slept comfortably." "Very well, thank you," she replied, her eyes kind but watchful. "You look a bit weary, Edward. I hope the engagement plans aren't too taxing." He laughed, but it was a strange sound. "Oh, just the usual fuss. Clara wants everything perfect, and Mother's helping, but—" He trailed off, pouring himself tea. "It's a lot." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she pulled her work from her bag. "Weddings do bring out strong feelings," she said. "I remember a young couple in St. Mary Mead, so in love, but their families quarrelled over every detail. It nearly broke them apart." Edward's hand paused on his cup. "That won't happen with us," he said quickly, but his eyes flicked to the window where the gardens stretched toward the horizon. "Clara and I are solid." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. She didn't press, but she noticed the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the cup. Edward was worried, and not just about flowers or guest lists. Clara appeared next, her golden hair catching the light as she entered. She wore a pale green dress, simple but elegant, and her smile was warm as she greeted Miss Marple. "I hope you're enjoying Ashford Hall," she said, sitting beside Edward. "It's so grand, isn't it? A bit overwhelming for me." "It's a beautiful place," Miss Marple said. "But beauty can hide all sorts of things, can't it? Like old stories or family secrets." She said it lightly, as if chatting about the weather, but she watched Clara closely. Clara's smile faltered just for a moment, and her hand brushed Edward's. "I suppose every old house has stories," she said, her voice soft, "but I'm here for the future, not the past." Edward squeezed her hand, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind filing away the exchange. Clara's words were hopeful, but her eyes held a shadow, just like Edward's. Something was weighing on them, something they weren't saying. Margaret stormed in next, her dark hair loose and her expression sour. "The florist still hasn't fixed the lilies," she announced, dropping into a chair. "Honestly, Clara, can't you pick people who know what they're doing?" Clara's cheeks flushed, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I'll call them again." "Do it soon," Margaret snapped, grabbing a piece of toast. "This engagement party is already a mess." "Margaret," Edward said, his voice low but firm. "That's enough." Margaret rolled her eyes but said nothing more. Miss Marple watched her, noting the anger in her tight lips and the way her fingers tore at the toast. Margaret wasn't just annoyed about flowers. She was angry about something deeper, something personal. Leonard was the last to join them, his dark hair untidy and his shirt slightly rumpled. He carried a small notebook, its edges worn, and he barely looked up as he muttered, "Morning." He sat at the far end of the table, sketching as he ate, his pencil scratching softly. Miss Marple smiled at him. "You're an artist, Leonard, aren't you? I'd love to see your work." He glanced up, his dark eyes guarded. "It's just sketches," he said, closing the notebook. "Nothing special." "Oh, I'm sure it's lovely," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "In St. Mary Mead, we had a young man who sketched birds. He saw things others missed. Artists have a way of noticing, don't they?" Leonard's hand tightened on his pencil, but he didn't reply. Miss Marple didn't push, but she noted his unease. Artists, she knew, often saw more than they said, and Leonard's silence felt heavy, like a locked door. Lady Beatrice entered last, her silver hair neat and her smile bright, though her eyes were tired. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice carrying a forced cheer. "I hope you all slept well. Jane, I trust the room was comfortable." "Very much so," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting aside. "This is a splendid house. Beatrice, so much history." Beatrice's smile tightened. "Yes, it's been in the family for generations. We're proud to carry it on." She poured tea, her hands steady but her movements careful, as if she were holding herself together. "Breakfast," continued, but the air was thick with unspoken words. Margaret barely spoke, her eyes fixed on her plate. Edward and Clara talked quietly, their heads close, but their voices were low, almost secretive. Leonard sketched, his pencil moving faster now, and Beatrice kept the conversation going, asking Miss Marple about village life. Miss Marple answered cheerfully, but her eyes never stopped moving, catching every glance, every pause. After breakfast, Beatrice suggested a walk in the gardens. "The roses are still blooming," she said. "Jane, you must see them." "I'd love to," Miss Marple said, tucking her knitting into her bag. The group moved outside, the crisp autumn air a welcome change from the heavy atmosphere of the dining room. The gardens were a marvel, neat rows of roses, their petals red and pink against the green, and a stone path winding toward a fountain. But Miss Marple's attention was on the people, not the flowers. Edward and Clara walked arm in arm, their steps slow, as if they were savouring the moment. Margaret lagged behind, kicking at pebbles with her shoe, her face stormy. Leonard wandered, off to a bench, his notebook open again, his pencil flying across the page. Beatrice stayed close to Miss Marple, pointing out different roses, but her voice was tight, her eyes darting to her children. "These roses were your husband's pride, weren't they?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. "I heard he loved gardening." Beatrice's smile faltered. "Yes, Reginald spent hours here. He said the roses kept him grounded." She paused, her fingers brushing a petal. "He was a good man, Jane. His death was such a shock." Miss Marple nodded, her face sympathetic. "A boating accident, wasn't it? So tragic." Beatrice's hand froze on the petal. "Yes," she said softly. 10 years ago. The lake was rough that day. He shouldn't have gone out." Her voice cracked and she turned away, pretending to adjust her scarf. Miss Marple didn't press, but her mind was working. In St. Mary Mead, she'd known a man who died in a tragic accident, only for it to turn out he'd been pushed into a quarry over a debt. Accidents, she knew, weren't always what they seemed. Beatrice's grief felt real, but there was something else there, fear, perhaps, or guilt. As they walked, Miss Marple noticed Clara slip away from Edward, heading toward a small gazebo. Edward watched her go, his face tight, then turned to join his mother. Miss Marple slowed her steps, letting Beatrice move ahead, and kept an eye on Clara. The young woman sat in the gazebo, her hands clasped, her head bowed. She looked like someone carrying a heavy weight. Margaret, meanwhile, had stopped near Leonard's bench. "What are you drawing now?" she asked, her voice sharp. "More of your gloomy scribbles?" Leonard didn't look up. "Leave it, Margaret," he said, his voice low. "I'm not in the mood." "You're never in the mood," she snapped. "Living here, eating our food, and what do you give back?" "Nothing." Leonard's pencil stopped, and he looked at her, his eyes dark. "You don't know everything, Margaret," he said quietly, then went back to sketching. Miss Marple, standing a few paces away, pretended to admire a rose. Margaret's anger wasn't just about Leonard's art. It was personal, rooted in something deeper, and Leonard's cryptic reply suggested he knew something she didn't. Miss Marple filed it away, her mind like a tidy drawer where every clue had its place. The group returned to the house for lunch, but the mood was no lighter. The dining room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Beatrice tried to keep things cheerful, talking about the engagement party planned for the next evening, but her words fell flat. Clara was quiet, picking at her food. Edward kept glancing at her, his brow furrowed. Margaret muttered complaints about the menu, and Leonard barely spoke, his notebook tucked under his arm. After lunch, Miss Marple excused herself to rest, but instead she wandered the halls, her steps soft on the thick carpets. The house was a maze of rooms, each one grander than the last. But there was a chill in the air, a sense that something was wrong. She passed a locked door in the east wing, its brass handle gleaming. A faint scratch mark on the frame caught her eye, barely visible unless you were looking. Miss Marple paused, her fingers brushing the mark. It was fresh, as if someone had tried to force the lock. She moved on, her heart quickening. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once found a similar mark on a shed where stolen goods were hidden. Locked doors, she knew, often guarded secrets. She made a mental note to ask Beatrice about the room later, in her gentle, roundabout way. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting in her lap. The afternoon light was fading, and the gardens below looked grey and still. She thought of the Ashfords, Beatrice's nervous hands, Margaret's anger, Edward's worry, Clara's unease, and Leonard's silence. Each of them was hiding something, she was sure of it. And that creak in the night, the one she'd heard after dinner, it hadn't been her imagination. Someone had been moving, careful and quiet, in the dark. She picked up her needles, the soft click filling the silence. The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple was starting to see its shape. There was a secret at Ashford Hall, something tied to the past, perhaps to Lord Reginald's death, and she would find it not by pushing or prying, but by watching and listening, the way she always did. As evening approached, Miss Marple prepared for dinner, choosing a plain grey dress that made her look harmless. She knew people spoke freely around someone they thought was just a sweet old lady. Downstairs, the dining room was lit with candles again, but the air was heavier than the night before. Beatrice greeted her warmly, but her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying. Edward and Clara sat close, their hands touching, but their faces were tense. Margaret was already at the table, her expression sour. Leonard arrived late, his notebook still in hand, his eyes avoiding everyone. Dinner began, but the conversation was strained. Beatrice talked about the weather, the roses, anything to fill the silence. Margaret made a sharp comment about Clara's dress. "A bit flashy, don't you think?" And Clara's cheeks flushed. Edward snapped at Margaret to stop, his voice sharper than before. Leonard said nothing, his pencil scratching in his notebook under the table. Miss Marple watched it all, her needles clicking softly. She didn't know the full story yet, but she could feel it. A storm gathering in this grand house, ready to break. And when it did, she would be ready, her sharp mind and gentle ways picking apart the secrets until the truth lay bare. As dessert was served, custard with fresh berries, she heard it again. A faint creak, this time from above, like footsteps, in a quiet hall. No one else seemed to notice, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The puzzle was growing, and she was one step closer to solving it. Chapter 3. A Cry in the Night. The moon hung low over Ashford Hall, its silver light slipping through the curtains of Miss Jane Marple's guest room. She sat by the window, her knitting idle in her lap, her eyes fixed on the dark gardens below. The house was quiet now. The dinner's tense chatter long faded, but sleep wouldn't come. Miss Marple's mind was too busy, turning over the day's clues like pebbles in a stream. The creak she'd heard the night before, Margaret's sharp words, Edward's worry, Clara's unease, Leonard's silence, and that scratch mark on the locked door in the east wing. They all pointed to something hidden, something the Ashfords didn't want seen. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, midnight. The house felt still but not peaceful. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a storm, when the air holds its breath. Miss Marple's fingers brushed her knitting needles, but she didn't pick them up. Instead, she listened, her ears sharp despite her years. St. Mary Mead had taught her that night was when secrets moved, when people thought no one was watching. A faint sound broke the silence, a muffled cry sharp and quick from somewhere in the east wing. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she stayed calm, her years of unravelling mysteries steadying her. She slipped on her dressing gown, a soft grey one that blended with the shadows, and tied the sash tight. Her slippers made no sound as she stepped into the hall, her small notebook tucked into her pocket. The corridor was dark, lit only by a single lamp that cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. The cry had come from the direction of Clara's room. Miss Marple moved quietly, her steps light on the thick carpet. The east wing was a maze of doors, each one heavy and polished, but she remembered the layout from her earlier wanderings. Clara's room was at the end near the locked door with the scratch mark. As she neared, she heard a soft rustle, like paper being crumpled, and a whispered voice. It can't be true. Miss Marple paused outside Clara's door, which was slightly ajar. Through the crack, she saw Clara pacing, her golden hair loose and tangled, her face pale in the moonlight. She clutched a crumpled letter, her hands shaking as she read it again. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear or disbelief. Miss Marple couldn't tell which. Clara stopped, glanced at the door, and quickly stuffed the letter into a drawer, slamming it shut. She sank onto the bed, her head in her hands, her shoulders trembling. Miss Marple stepped back, her mind racing. A letter, hidden in haste, and a cry in the night. Clara was scared, and not just about wedding plans. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once found a letter that broke a case wide open. A note from a lover hidden in a drawer that led to a murder. She didn't know what Clara's letter held, but it was a piece of the puzzle, and she'd find a way to see it. The hall was silent again, but Miss Marple's senses were alert. She moved toward the locked door she'd seen earlier, her fingers brushing the scratch mark again. It was deeper than she'd thought, as if someone had used a tool to pry at the lock. She pressed her ear to the wood, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. Still, she felt watched, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She turned back to her room, her slippers whispering on the carpet, and locked the door behind her. Sleep could wait. The night had given her a clue, and she wouldn't let it slip away. Morning came with a grey sky, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Marple dressed in her usual neat frock, this time a soft green that matched the gardens, and pinned her grey hat carefully. She tucked her knitting and notebook into her bag and headed downstairs, her mind still on Clara's cry and the aim et de coudin letter. The dining room was set for breakfast, but only Beatrice was there, sipping tea and staring out the window. "Good morning, Jane," Beatrice said, her smile warm but strained. Her silver hair was perfect, but her eyes were red, as if she too had been awake in the night. "I hope you slept well." "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple lied, settling at the table. "Though I did hear a noise last night. A cry, perhaps from the east wing." Beatrice's cup clinked against its saucer. "Oh, probably just the wind," she said quickly. "This old house creaks and groans sometimes." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind but her eyes sharp. Beatrice's quick answer was too smooth, like a stitch pulled too tight. "Of course," she said, spreading jam on her toast. "Old houses do have their voices." Edward joined them next, his face still tired, his smile polite but thin. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, pouring coffee. "Mother, have you seen Clara? She wasn't in her room." Beatrice's hand paused on her cup. "She's probably in the garden," she said, but her voice was tight. "She likes the roses." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she pulled out her knitting. "Young love is so sweet," she said, her tone light. "But it can be heavy too, with all the expectations. I knew a girl in St. Mary Mead who got a letter that changed everything before her wedding." Edward's eyes flicked to her, then away. "Clara's fine," he said too quickly, "just nervous about the party." He sipped his coffee, but his hand shook slightly. Miss Marple smiled, her needles moving steadily. Edward knew something, just like Clara. The letter was important, and it was tied to the tension in this house. She made a mental note to watch Clara closely, to find a moment to ask about the night. Margaret stormed in, her dark hair pulled back, but her face stormy. "The florist called," she announced, dropping into a chair. "They're sending roses, but they'll be late. Honestly, Clara's making a mess of this." "Margaret," Beatrice said softly, a warning in her tone. Margaret rolled her eyes but didn't argue. She grabbed a muffin and tore it apart, her fingers restless. Miss Marple watched her, noting the anger that seemed to burn under her skin. Margaret wasn't just annoyed about flowers, she was furious, and it felt personal, aimed at Clara or maybe the whole family. Leonard was last as usual, his dark hair messy and his notebook under his arm. He muttered a greeting and sat at the far end, sketching as he ate. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Leonard, I saw you sketching in the garden yesterday. Do you draw the house, too?" He looked up, his eyes guarded. "Sometimes," he said, "the moonlight changes it, makes it different." "Different how?" Miss Marple asked, her tone curious but kind. Leonard shrugged, closing his notebook. "Just shadows. They hide things." He went back to his food, but his pencil tapped nervously on the table. Miss Marple's mind turned. Shadows, hiding things. Leonard's words felt like a clue, though she wasn't sure what it meant yet. He saw more than he said, and his sketches might hold answers. She'd have to find a way to see that notebook. Clara arrived just as breakfast ended, her face pale, but her smile bright. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sitting beside Edward. "I was walking in the garden. It's so peaceful." Edward took her hand, but his eyes searched her face as if looking for something. Miss Marple watched them, her needles clicking. Clara's cheer was forced, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, as if holding herself together. Beatrice suggested a tour of the house after breakfast, and Miss Marple agreed eagerly. "I'd love to see more of this beautiful place," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. A tour would give her a chance to look at that locked door again, maybe even ask about it without raising suspicion. The group moved through the house, Beatrice leading the way. The halls were grand, lined with portraits of Ashford's past, their eyes stern and watchful. Beatrice pointed out paintings and antiques, her voice proud but her hands nervous, twisting a handkerchief. Edward and Clara stayed close, their steps slow, while Margaret trailed behind, muttering about dust. Leonard followed silently, his notebook tucked under his arm. They reached the east wing, and Miss Marple's heart quickened as they neared the locked door. "What's behind this one?" she asked, her voice innocent. "It looks so sturdy." Beatrice's smile froze. "Oh, that's just my late husband's study," she said, her words quick. "We keep it locked. It's private." "Of course," Miss Marple said, nodding. "Old papers and memories, I suppose. I knew a man in St. Mary Mead who kept his study locked too. Turned out he was hiding letters from a business deal gone wrong." Beatrice's face paled, but she laughed lightly. "Nothing like that here, Jane. Just dusty old books." She moved on quickly, pointing out a painting of a ship. But Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the door. The scratch mark was still there, and it looked fresher in the daylight, as if someone had tried again in the night. The tour ended in the library, a vast room with shelves reaching the ceiling. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the books, her mind still on the locked door. "This is a treasure," she said, smiling at Beatrice. "Did Lord Reginald spend much time here?" Beatrice nodded, her eyes distant. "He loved his books, and his study, of course. He was always working on something." "Business, was it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "I heard he was quite successful." Beatrice's hands tightened on her handkerchief. "Yes, he was. Investments, mostly. He did a lot of good with his money, you know. Charities, schools." Her voice trailed off, and she turned away, pretending to adjust a vase. Miss Marple didn't push, but her mind was busy. In St. Mary Mead, she'd known a man whose charity was a cover for shady deals. Lord Reginald's death, the locked study, the scratch mark, they all pointed to something hidden, maybe tied to his business. And Clara's letter, the cry in the night, it was all connected, she was sure. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting in her lap, watching the family. Beatrice was writing letters, her pen moving quickly, but her eyes kept darting to the door. Edward and Clara were playing cards, their laughter forced. Margaret was reading a magazine, flipping pages too fast to actually read. Leonard was sketching again, his pencil scratching softly. Miss Marple decided to try Clara. She moved to a chair beside her, her needles clicking. "You must be so excited about the party tomorrow," she said, her voice warm. "It's a big step getting engaged." Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, it's wonderful," she said, her voice soft. "Edward's so kind. I'm lucky. Love is a gift," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, "but it can be scary too. I knew a girl in St. Mary Mead who got a letter before her wedding. It upset her terribly, but she didn't tell anyone. Keeping secrets can be so heavy." Clara's cards slipped from her hand, scattering on the table. "Oh," she said, scrambling to pick them up. Her cheeks were pink, and her eyes avoided Miss Marple's. "I'm so clumsy." Edward helped her gather the cards, his hand lingering on hers. "You're fine," he said, but his voice was tight. Miss Marple smiled, her needles never stopping. Clara's reaction was proof. The letter was important, and she was scared. Dinner that evening was quieter than the night before, the air thick with tension. Beatrice tried to keep things light, talking about the party plans, but her voice was strained. Margaret snapped at the maid about the soup being too cold. Edward and Clara barely spoke, their eyes on their plates. Leonard was silent, his notebook open beside him, his pencil moving in quick, sharp strokes. Miss Marple watched it all, her mind piecing together the clues. The cry in the night, Clara's letter, the locked door, Beatrice's nervousness, Margaret's anger, Edward's worry, Leonard's sketches. It was a puzzle, and the pieces were starting to fit. She didn't know the whole picture yet, but she was getting closer. As they finished dessert, a creamy pudding with raspberries, Miss Marple heard it again. A faint creak, this time from the hall outside. She glanced at the others, but no one seemed to notice. Beatrice was talking about the weather. Margaret was glaring at her plate. Edward and Clara were whispering, and Leonard was sketching. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Someone was moving. In the house, someone who didn't want to be heard. She excused herself early, claiming tiredness, and climbed the stairs slowly, her ears sharp. The hall was dark, but she paused near the locked door again, listening. There was no sound now, but the scratch mark gleamed in the lamplight, deeper than before. Someone had been at it again, and recently. Back in her room, Miss Marple locked the door and sat by the window, her knitting in her lap. The moon was brighter tonight, casting sharp shadows across the gardens. She thought of Clara's cry, the letter, the locked study, and the creaks in the night. The Ashfords were hiding. Something tied to the past, maybe to Lord Reginald's death. And someone, Clara, perhaps, or Leonard, was closer to that secret than they wanted to be. Her needles clicked softly, the pink scarf growing longer. The storm was gathering at Ashford Hall, and Miss Marple was ready to face it. She didn't know what the secret was yet, but she would find it, stitch by stitch, with her quiet ways and sharp eyes. The night was full of shadows, but Miss Marple knew how to find the light. Chapter 4. The Locked Study. The morning light was soft and grey as it slipped through the curtains of Miss Jane Marple's guest room at Ashford Hall. She woke with the dawn, her mind already picking at the threads of the mystery she'd found the night before. Clara's cry, the crumpled letter, the scratch mark on the locked door, and the creaks in the dark. Each was a clue, small but sharp, like the stitches in her knitting. Miss Marple, dressed in a neat brown frock, pinned her grey hat with its single feather, and tucked her knitting and notebook into her bag. Today, she knew, would bring more pieces to the puzzle. Downstairs, the dining room was quiet, the table set with fresh bread, butter, and a pot of tea. Elsie, the maid, was there, her hands busy, but her eyes nervous, darting to the door as she poured Miss Marple's tea. "Good morning, ma'am," Elsie said, her voice quick. "The families? Not down yet. They're all frazzled with the party tonight." "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple said, her smile kind but her eyes watchful. "Big events do stir things up. I heard a noise again last night from the east wing. Did you hear anything?" Elsie's hands froze on the teapot just for a second. "No, ma'am," she said too fast. "Just the house settling, I expect." She hurried off to the kitchen, her apron flapping. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind noting Elsie's rush. Servants saw everything, she knew, and Elsie's quick answer was like a curtain pulled over a secret. In St. Mary Mead, her maid Cherry had once let slip a detail about a neighbour's late-night visitor, and it had cracked a case wide open. Elsie knew something, and Miss Marple would find a way to learn what. Lady Beatrice entered next, her silver hair perfect, but her face pale, with shadows under her eyes. "Good morning, Jane," she said, her voice warm but shaky. "I hope you're ready for the engagement party tonight. It's going to be splendid." "I'm sure it will be," Miss Marple said, spreading butter on her bread. "You look tired, Beatrice. Is everything all right?" Beatrice's smile wavered. "Oh, just the usual fuss. So much to do." She poured tea, her hands trembling slightly, and changed the subject. "Have you seen the library yet? It's Reginald's pride." "Not properly," Miss Marple said, seizing the chance. "I'd love to explore it today. And that locked room in the east wing, your husband's study, you said? It must hold so many memories." Beatrice's cup clinked against its saucer. "Yes, well, it's just old papers," she said, her words quick. "Nothing worth seeing." She sipped her tea, but her eyes didn't meet Miss Marple's. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she pulled out her knitting. Beatrice's nervousness was a clue, just like the scratch mark on the locked door. The study was important, and someone had been trying to get in. She'd have to find a way to see it, but carefully. Pushing too hard would make the family close up like a locked gate. Edward and Clara came in together, their hands linked but their faces tight. Edward's smile was polite, but his eyes were tired, like he hadn't slept. Clara's golden hair was neat, but her smile was forced, and she kept glancing at Edward, as if checking for something. "Morning, Miss Marple," Edward said, pulling out a chair for Clara. "I hope you're enjoying your stay." "Very much," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "It's a lovely house, though old places can feel heavy sometimes. I knew a family in St. Mary Mead whose old study held secrets that caused quite a stir." Clara's hand shook as she reached for her tea, and a drop spilled on the table. "Oh, how clumsy," she said, dabbing it with a napkin. Edward touched her arm, his face concerned, but he said nothing. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Clara's nerves were tied to that letter, she was sure, and Edward knew something about it. The secret was close, and it was making them both jumpy. Margaret stormed in, her dark hair loose and her eyes flashing. "The caterer's late," she announced, dropping into a chair. Clara, can't you pick people who show up on time?" Clara's cheeks pinked, but she kept her voice calm. "I'll call them, Margaret. It's under control." "It better be," Margaret snapped, grabbing a roll. "This party's already a disaster." "Margaret," Beatrice said, her voice sharp now. "That's enough." Margaret rolled her eyes but stayed quiet, tearing her roll apart with quick, angry fingers. Miss Marple watched her, noting the bitterness in her tight lips. Margaret's anger wasn't just about the party. It was deep, like a wound that hadn't healed. Leonard was last as usual, his dark hair messy and his notebook tucked under his arm. He muttered a greeting and sat at the far end, sketching as he ate. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Leonard, your sketches must be full of this house's character. Do you ever draw the study? It sounds like such an important room." Leonard's pencil stopped and his eyes flicked up, guarded. "I don't go in there," he said, his voice low. "It's locked. Always has been." He went back to sketching, but his hand was tense, his lines sharp. Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving. Leonard's quick answer was like Elsie's, too fast, hiding something. The study was a key, and someone had tried to open it. She'd have to watch Leonard closely, maybe find a way to see his sketches. Breakfast ended, and Beatrice suggested everyone help with party preparations. "We need to check the ballroom," she said, her voice bright but strained. "Jane, would you like to join us?" "I'd rather explore the library, if that's all right," Miss Marple said, smiling. "Books are such good company." Beatrice nodded, relieved, and the family scattered. Edward and Clara to the ballroom, Margaret to call the caterer, Leonard to the garden, and Beatrice to her letters. Miss Marple headed to the library, but her real goal was the East Wing. She wanted another look at that locked door. The library was grand, with tall shelves and the smell of old leather. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the books, her eyes sharp for anything out of place. She found a section on local history, including a book about the Ashfords. It mentioned Lord Reginald's wealth, his charity work and his boating accident, but nothing about his business. Still, she noted the author's name, Victor Crane, a name that sounded familiar, though she couldn't place it. In St. Mary, Mead, she'd once solved a theft by tracing a name in a book. This might be another clue. She slipped out of the library and headed to the East Wing, her steps quiet. The hall was empty, the locked door waiting like a challenge. She examined the scratch mark again, her fingers tracing its edges. It was deeper now, as if someone had tried again in the night. She pressed her ear to the door, listening, but heard only silence. Still, the air felt heavy, like the house was watching her. As she turned to leave, a shout echoed from downstairs. "Beatrice! The study!" It was Edward's voice, sharp with panic. Miss Marple hurried down, her heart quickening but her face calm. She found the family in the East Wing, gathered outside the locked door, which now stood open. Beatrice was pale, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "It's been broken into," she said, her voice shaking. "Reginald's study. Someone's been inside." Edward stood by the door, his face tight. "Papers are everywhere," he said. "And a box is missing, a small one with a carved lid." Clara clutched his arm, her eyes wide. Margaret was furious, her fists clenched. "Who did this?" she demanded. "Who's been snooping?" Leonard stood back, his notebook clutched to his chest, his eyes darting to the floor. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle. "How awful," she said. "Was the box important, Beatrice?" Beatrice hesitated, her eyes flicking to Edward. "Just family papers," she said. "Nothing valuable, but it's private." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. In St. Mary Mead, a missing box had once held letters that exposed a blackmail scheme. This box, she was sure, held something the Ashfords wanted hidden. The scratch mark, the open door, the missing box. It all pointed to someone in the house, someone desperate. "Let's look inside," Edward said, stepping into the study. The family followed, and Miss Marple slipped in behind them, her eyes sharp. The room was small but grand, with a heavy desk, bookshelves and portraits of stern Ashfords. Papers were scattered across the desk, drawers half open, as if someone had searched in a hurry. A fireplace stood cold, its mantel bare except for a single candlestick. Miss Marple's gaze caught on the fireplace. A faint scratch mark, like the one on the door, marred the stone near the hearth. It was small, almost invisible, but it suggested a hidden compartment. She'd seen one in St. Mary Mead, behind a fireplace, where a will had been hidden. She didn't mention it, not yet. Pointing it out would make the family suspicious. "Who could have done this?" Margaret snapped, glaring at Clara. "You're new here. Been poking around, have you?" Clara's face flushed. "I didn't touch anything," she said, her voice trembling. "I wouldn't." "Enough, Margaret," Edward said, his tone sharp. "We don't know who did it." Beatrice's hands shook as she gathered the papers. "We'll sort this out," she said, her voice thin. "It's probably just a mistake." Miss Marple watched them, her needles idle in her bag. Beatrice's quick dismissal, Margaret's accusation, Clara's fear, Edward's defence, Leonard's silence. Each reaction was a clue. Someone knew about the box, and someone had taken it. But why? The family decided to search the house, hoping to find the box. Beatrice asked Miss Marple to join them, but she smiled and said, "I'll stay here if you don't mind. I'll tidy these papers." Beatrice hesitated, then nodded, and the family left, their voices fading down the hall. Alone in the study, Miss Marple moved quickly. She checked the desk first, finding only old bills and letters about charity events. Then she knelt by the fireplace, her fingers tracing the scratch mark. The stone felt loose, and with a gentle push, a small panel clicked open. Inside was a dusty space, empty now, but the size of a small box. Someone had been here first, and recently. Footsteps approached, and Miss Marple stood, brushing her hands on her dress. Margaret burst in, her eyes flashing. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "This is a family matter." "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "I was just tidying, as I said. I'm so sorry if I overstepped." Margaret's glare softened, but only slightly. "Stay out of it," she said, then stormed out. Miss Marple's heart was steady, but her mind was racing. The empty compartment, the missing box, Margaret's anger, it all fit together, though the picture wasn't clear yet. She left the study, closing the door behind her, and returned to the drawing room, her knitting in her lap. The family returned, empty-handed. Beatrice looked shaken, Edward tense, Clara pale, Margaret furious, and Leonard silent, his notebook still clutched tight. The box is gone," Beatrice said, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll have to let it go." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Things have a way of turning up," she said, her tone light. "In St. Mary Mead, a lost locket once solved a mystery." Beatrice forced a smile, but her eyes were worried. The family dispersed, and Miss Marple stayed, her mind working. The box was key, and someone had taken it. Someone in this house. Clara's letter, the locked study, the scratch marks, the creaks in the night, they were all part of the same secret tied to Lord Reginald's past, she was sure. As evening approached, the house buzzed with preparations for the engagement party. Servants carried flowers and candles to the ballroom, and music drifted from a piano. But the air was heavy, the tension thicker than ever. Miss Marple, dressed in her grey dress, her hat neat, and headed downstairs, her knitting bag on her arm. The party would be a chance to watch, to listen, to find the next clue. In the ballroom, guests were arriving, their laughter loud but hollow against the family's strain. Beatrice greeted everyone with a smile, but her hands twisted her handkerchief. Edward and Clara stood together, their smiles forced. Margaret hovered near the door, her eyes sharp. Leonard stood alone, sketching in his notebook, his face closed. Miss Marple mingled, her gentle ways making people talk. A local doctor mentioned Lord Reginald's charity, but his voice dropped when he spoke of rumours about his business. A neighbour whispered about a man named Victor Crane, a name Miss Marple remembered from the library book. She filed it away, her mind like a tidy drawer. As the music played, she heard it again. A faint creak, this time from above, like footsteps in the east wing. No one else noticed, lost in the party's noise. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The storm was close now, and the missing box was at its heart. She would find it, and the secret it held, with her quiet ways and sharp eyes, stitch by stitch. Chapter 5. The Shadow of the Past. The chandeliers in Ashford Hall's ballroom sparkled like stars, casting golden light over the engagement party. Laughter and music filled the air, but Miss Jane Marple felt the tension beneath it, sharp as a needle in her knitting. The missing box from the study, Clara's crumpled letter, the scratch marks on the locked door, and the creaks in the night. They were all pieces of a puzzle, and she was starting to see their shape. She stood near a window, her grey dress blending with the shadows, her knitting bag at her side. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, moved over the crowd, watching the Ashford family. Lady Beatrice glided among the guests, her silver hair gleaming, her smile bright but tight. Edward and Clara stood together, their hands linked, but their faces were stiff, like they were playing parts in a play. Margaret hovered by the punch table, her dark eyes flashing as she watched Clara. Leonard leaned against a wall, sketching in his worn notebook, his face closed. The party was grand, but the family was a tangle of nerves, and Miss Marple knew why. Someone had taken that box, and it held a secret they feared. She sipped her lemonade, her mind turning over the clues. The name Victor Crane, from the library book, stuck with her. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once solved a case by tracing a name in a letter, a name tied to a shady deal. Victor Crane felt like that kind of clue, linked to Lord Reginald's past, maybe to his accident 10 years ago. the missing box, the locked study, Clara's cry in the night. They all pointed to something hidden, something the Ashfords wanted buried. Miss Marple moved through the crowd, her steps slow, her smile gentle. She chatted with a local vicar, who praised Lord Reginald's charity, but hesitated when she asked about his business. He was a generous man, the vicar said, his voice low, but some said his money came from less noble sources. He glanced around, then changed the subject. Next, she spoke to a neighbour, Mrs. Harrow, who mentioned Victor Crane again. He was a friend of Reginald's, Mrs. Harrow whispered, her eyes wide. A businessman, but not the honest kind. There were rumours, you know, before the accident. She stopped, as if she'd said too much, and hurried off to join the dancers. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. Victor Crane was no random name. He was tied to Reginald, and maybe to the box. She needed to learn more, but gently, like easing a knot from her wool. She found Beatrice near the piano, her hands twisting a silk scarf. "What a lovely party," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "You must be so proud of Edward and Clara." Beatrice's smile was strained. "Yes, it's a happy time," she said, but her eyes darted to her son. "They're a good match." "They seem so," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she pulled out her knitting. "This house must hold so many memories of your husband. He was such a big part of the community, wasn't he?" Beatrice's hands froze on her scarf. "Reginald was a wonderful man," she said, her voice soft. "He did so much for others, schools, hospitals." She trailed off, her eyes distant. "I heard he was a businessman too," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "Investments, wasn't it? I knew a man in St. Mary Mead who made his fortune abroad, but it brought trouble. People talk, don't they?" Beatrice's face paled, and her scarf slipped to the floor. "Oh, people always gossip," she said, bending to pick it up. "Reginald's work was honest. He just loved the sea. That's why the accident was so terrible." Her voice cracked and she turned away, pretending to adjust a flower arrangement. Miss Marple nodded, her needles steady. Beatrice's words were smooth, but her fear was real. The mention of Reginald's business had struck a nerve, and the accident felt like more than bad luck. In St. Mary Mead, she'd unravelled a case where an accident hid a betrayal. This felt the same, a shadow from the past tied to Victor Crane and the missing box. The music changed, a slower tune, and Edward led Clara to the dance floor. They moved gracefully, but their smiles were tight, their eyes avoiding each other. Miss Marple watched them, her mind on Clara's letter. She needed to talk to Clara alone, to learn what had made her cry in the night. She found her chance when Clara stepped away to get a drink. Miss Marple joined her at the punch table, her voice gentle. "You look lovely tonight, Clara," she said, "but you seem a bit tired. Is everything all right?" Clara's hand shook as she poured her drink, spilling a drop. "Oh, I'm fine," she said, her smile forced. "Just nervous about the party." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone kind. "Big events can be heavy. I knew a girl in St. Mary Mead who got a letter before her wedding. It upset her so much she nearly called it off. Secrets can weigh on us, can't they?" Clara's glass trembled, and her eyes flicked to Miss Marple, then away. I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She set her glass down and hurried back to Edward, her steps quick. Miss Marple's needles clicked. Clara's fear was tied to that letter, and it was no ordinary note. It was connected to the box, the study, and maybe Victor Crane. She needed to see that letter, but pushing Clara now would only scare her more. Patience, Miss Marple knew, was her best tool. The party continued, but the air grew heavier. Margaret was arguing with a servant about the dessert trays, her voice sharp. Leonard stood alone, sketching faster now, his eyes darting to the family. Beatrice moved among the guests, her smile fixed, but her hands restless. Edward and Clara danced again, but their steps were stiff, like they were holding something back. Sir, Marple slipped out to the terrace, needing a moment to think. The night was cool, the gardens dark except for the moonlight on the roses. She heard voices, low, angry, and stepped closer, staying in the shadows. It was Edward and Clara near a stone bench, their words sharp but hushed. "You don't understand what's at stake," Edward said, his voice tight. "We have to keep it quiet." "I won't be part of this lie," Clara hissed, her voice shaking. "I can't, Edward, not after what I know." "It's not a lie," Edward said, his tone desperate. "It's protecting the family. Please, Clara." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she stayed still, her knitting bag clutched in her hands. Clara's words confirmed it. The letter held a secret, something big enough to threaten the engagement, and Edward was part of it, trying to keep it buried. She thought of the missing box, the scratched door, and Victor Crane. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still blurry. Clara pulled away from Edward and hurried back inside, her face pale. Edward stood alone, his head bowed, his hands clenched. Miss Marple waited, then stepped back into the ballroom, her face calm. She didn't need to hear more. The argument was a clue, and it pointed to a secret that was tearing the family apart. Inside, the party was winding down, guests saying their goodbyes. Beatrice thanked everyone, her voice bright but her eyes tired. Margaret was nowhere to be seen, and Leonard had vanished, his notebook gone with him. Miss Marple approached Beatrice, her smile gentle. "Such a lovely evening," she said. "You've done wonders, Beatrice." "Thank you, Jane," Beatrice said, her hands twisting her scarf again. "It's a lot, but I'm glad it went well." "It did," Miss Marple said, her tone kind. "Though I imagine it's hard with Reginald gone. He must have loved parties like this." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "He did," she said softly. "He was the heart of this house." She paused, then added, "I should check on the servants." "Good night, Jane," Miss Marple nodded, watching her. "Go." Beatrice's grief was real, but so was her fear. The mention of Reginald always brought it out, like a shadow behind her words. Miss Marple headed upstairs, her steps slow, her mind busy. The party had given her new clues. Victor Crane, Clara's fear, Edward's desperation. But she needed more. In her room she sat by the window, her knitting in her lap. The moon was high now, casting sharp shadows across the gardens. She thought of the locked study, the missing box, and the scratch mark by the fireplace. Someone had taken the box, and someone was scared. Clara, Edward, maybe Beatrice. and Leonard, with his sketches and silence, was watching it all. She opened her notebook and jotted down the name Victor Crane, underlining it. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once found a name in a ledger that led to a smuggler's ring. Victor Crane felt like that, a name that could unlock the secret. She needed to learn more about him, and about Reginald's business. The library might hold answers, or maybe Leonard's sketches. She'd have to be careful, though. The family was on edge, and pushing too hard would make them close up. A faint creak sounded in the hall, the same one she'd heard before. Miss Marple froze, her ears sharp. It was soft, deliberate, like someone moving carefully. She slipped to the door and peered out, but the hall was empty, the shadows still. Someone was up, searching or hiding, and they didn't want to be seen. She locked her door and returned to her chair, her needles clicking softly. The pink scarf was nearly done, its stitches neat and even. The mystery was like that scarf, each clue a stitch, building toward the whole. She didn't know the full pattern yet, but she was getting closer. The box, the letter, Victor Crane, Reginald's death, they were all tied together, and the truth was buried in the past. Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight. A woman there had once kept a letter that exposed her husband's debts, and it nearly ruined her. Clara's letter felt the same, dangerous, heavy, a key to the Ashfords' fear. And the box, taken from the study, held something just as dangerous. She needed to find it, or at least learn what it held. The night grew quieter, the creaks gone. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and looked out at the gardens. The roses were silver in the moonlight, their beauty hiding thorns. Ashford Hall was like that, grand and lovely, but sharp with secrets. She thought of Beatrice's nervous hands, Margaret's anger, Edward's worry, Clara's fear, and Leonard's sketches. Each was a thread, and she would pull them gently, carefully, until the truth unravelled. She climbed into bed, her mind still working. Tomorrow she'd talk to Leonard, maybe ask to see his sketches. She'd watch Clara too, and find a way to ask about the letter without scaring her. And though library, she'd look for more about Victor Crane, maybe in old newspapers or letters. The puzzle was growing, and Miss Marple was ready to solve it, stitch by stitch. As she closed her eyes, the house creaked again, a faint sound from the east wing. She didn't stir, but her lips curved into a small smile. Someone was moving, and she was listening. The shadow of the past was long, but Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, and she wouldn't let it hide forever. Chapter 6. A Dangerous Discovery. The morning sun crept through the heavy curtains of Ashford Hall, casting pale light across Miss Jane Marple's guest room. She woke early, her mind buzzing with the clues she'd gathered. Clara's crumpled letter, the missing box from the locked study, the scratch marks, the creaks in the night, and the name Victor Crane, tied to Lord Reginald's past. Each was a stitch in the mystery, and Miss Marple was determined to knit them together. She dressed in a simple grey frock, pinned her grey hat with its single feather, and tucked her knitting and notebook into her bag. Today, she felt, would bring her closer to the truth. Downstairs, the dining room was quiet, the table set with toast, jam, and steaming tea. Elsie, the maid, was there, her hands quick but her eyes nervous, darting to the door as she poured Miss Marple's tea. "Good morning, ma'am," Elsie said, her voice tight. "The family's not up yet. They're all on edge after yesterday." "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple said, her smile warm but her eyes sharp. "The missing box must have upset everyone. Did you see anything odd last night?" Elsie's hands shook, and she nearly dropped the teapot. "No, ma'am," she said too fast. "Just the usual noises. Old houses, you know." She hurried off to the kitchen, her apron flapping. Miss Marple spread jam on her toast, her mind noting Elsie's fear. Servants always knew more than they said, and Elsie's quick answer was like a locked door. In St. Mary Mead, a maid's slip about a late-night visitor had once led to a thief's capture. Elsie was hiding something, and Miss Marple would find a way to learn it. Lady Beatrice entered, her silver hair neat but her face pale, with deep shadows under her eyes. "Good morning, Jane," she said, her voice trying to be bright but failing. "I hope you enjoyed the party." "It was lovely," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "Though the business with the study must be worrying you. That box, you think it's really gone?" Beatrice's cup clinked against its saucer. "It's just papers," she said, her words quick. "Nothing important. We'll find it." She looked away, her hands twisting her napkin. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she pulled out her knitting. Beatrice's fear was clear, and her dismissal of the box was too quick, like a stitch pulled tight to hide a flaw. The box held something big, something tied to the past, and Beatrice knew it. Edward and Clara came in next, their hands linked but their faces tense. Edward's smile was thin, his eyes tired, as if he'd been up all night. Clara's golden hair was tidy, but her smile was forced, and she kept glancing at Edward like she was checking for something. "Morning, Miss Marple," Edward said, pulling out Clara's chair. "I hope you slept well?" "Quite well," Miss Marple said, her tone light, "though old houses do have their noises. I heard a creak again last night, near the east wing." Clara's hand froze on her cup, and a drop of tea spilled. "Oh, how clumsy," she said, dabbing it with a napkin. Edward touched her arm, his face tight, but he said nothing. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Clara's nerves were tied to that letter, and Edward was part of it. In St. Mary Mead, a spilled cup had once betrayed a woman's guilt. Clara wasn't guilty, but she was scared, and the letter was the key. Margaret stormed in, her dark hair loose, her eyes flashing. "The caterer left a mess in the ballroom," she snapped, dropping into a chair. "Clara, can't you hire people? Who clean up?" Clara's cheeks pinked, but she kept her voice calm. "I'll talk to them, Margaret," she said. "It's handled." "It better be," Margaret muttered, grabbing a piece of toast. Her fingers tore at it, her anger sharp as a knife. Miss Marple watched her, noting the bitterness in her tight lips. Margaret's anger was deeper than party troubles. It was personal, aimed at Clara or maybe the whole family. Leonard was last, his dark hair messy, his notebook under his arm. He muttered a greeting and sat at the far end, sketching as he ate. Miss Marple saw her chance. "Leonard," she said, her voice gentle, "I'd love to take a walk in the garden later. Would you join me? Your sketches make me curious about how you see this place." Leonard's pencil stopped and his eyes flicked up, guarded. "Maybe," he said, his voice low. I'm busy today." He went back to sketching, but his hand was tense, his lines sharp. Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving. Leonard's wariness was a clue. He was hiding something, maybe in that notebook. She'd have to be patient, but a walk might loosen his tongue. After breakfast, Beatrice suggested everyone help with the clean-up from the party. "The ballroom needs tidying," she said, her voice strained. "Jane, will you join us?" "I'd like to visit the library again," Miss Marple said, smiling. "Books are such good company, and I didn't finish looking yesterday." In truth, she wanted to search for more about Victor Crane, and maybe find a way to see that locked study again. Beatrice nodded, relieved, and the family scattered. Edward and Clara to the ballroom, Margaret to make calls, Leonard to the garden, and Beatrice to her letters. Miss Marple headed to the library, her steps quiet on the polished floors. The house felt heavy today, the air thick with secrets, like a storm waiting to break. The library was vast, its shelves towering to the ceiling, filled with the smell of old leather and dust. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the books, her eyes sharp for anything about Victor Crane or Lord Reginald's business. She found the book from yesterday, the one about the Ashfords, and flipped through it again. It mentioned Reginald's charity, but nothing about his investments, only that Victor Crane was a business associate. The name sent a shiver down her spine. She'd heard it twice now, from Mrs. Harrow and the vicar, and it felt like a key. She moved to a section of old newspapers, hoping for more. The papers were yellowed, some from 10 years ago, around the time of Reginald's death. She scanned the headlines, her fingers careful on the brittle pages. One article caught her. Local philanthropist dies in boating tragedy. It described Reginald's accident on the lake, calling it a sudden storm. But a small note mentioned Victor Crane, a partner who had been with him that day but survived. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Crane was there when Reginald died. That wasn't just a coincidence. She tucked the newspaper under her arm, planning to read more later, and moved to the shelves near the back. The library was quiet, but she felt watched, as if the portraits on the walls were following her. She reached a tall bookshelf, its wood carved with roses, and noticed a panel that looked slightly off, like it didn't quite fit. In St. Mary Mead she'd once found a hidden drawer in a desk that held a stolen will. Her fingers brushed the panel, and it clicked softly, sliding open. Inside was a small space, dusty but not empty. There, tucked in the corner, was the missing box from the study. A small, ornate thing with a carved lid, just as Edward had described. Miss Marple's breath caught, but she stayed calm, her years of sleuthing keeping her steady. She lifted the box carefully, its weight light but solid, and opened it. Inside were a bundle of letters tied with string and a thin ledger, its pages yellowed. She glanced at the letters, her eyes quick. They were written in Reginald's hand, addressed to Victor Crane, and spoke of shipments and payments that needed to stay secret. One line stood out. "The deal must stay buried, Victor, or it will ruin us." The ledger listed dates and amounts, payments to an unnamed account, all from the year before Reginald's death. Miss Marple's mind raced. In St. Mary Mead, a ledger like this had exposed a smuggling ring. This was bigger, tied to Reginald's wealth, maybe his death. Footsteps sounded outside, and Miss Marple quickly closed the box, slipping it back into the panel. She pushed it shut just as the library door opened. It was Leonard, his notebook in hand, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Oh, just browsing," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I love old books. Do you come here to sketch?" Leonard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Sometimes," he said, moving to a chair. He opened his notebook, but his eyes kept flicking to her like he was watching. Miss Marple sat nearby, pulling out her knitting. "You must see so much being an artist," she said, her tone light. "In St. Mary Mead, an artist once sketched a clue that solved a theft. Do you ever draw the study?" Leonard's pencil stopped, and his eyes darkened. "I told you, it's locked," he said, his voice low. "I don't go there." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "But you notice things, don't you? Like shadows in this house." Leonard's hand shook, and he closed his notebook. "I've got to go," he muttered, standing quickly. He left, his steps fast, almost running. Miss Marple's heart was steady, but her mind was racing. Leonard knew something. His sketches, his wariness, his quick exit. The box was proof the secret was real, and someone had hidden it here, away from the study. But who? Clara, with her letter? Edward, protecting his family? Or Leonard, who saw more than he said? She returned to the library's main room, the newspaper still under her arm. She needed to read more about Victor Crane, but not now. The family would be back soon, and she couldn't be caught snooping. She slipped the paper into her bag, planning to read it in her room, and headed to the garden to find Leonard. A walk might loosen his tongue, and she needed to know what he was hiding. The garden was quiet, the roses heavy with dew. Leonard sat on a bench, sketching furiously, his face tight. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice gentle. He looked up, his eyes guarded. "I'm busy," he said, but he didn't move. Miss Marple sat anyway, her knitting in her lap. "It's peaceful here," she said, "but this house feels heavy, doesn't it? Like it's holding secrets." Leonard's pencil paused, and he looked at her, his eyes searching. "You notice too much," he said, his voice low. "This family, they're generous, but it comes with strings. I'm here because of them, but it's not free." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Families can be like that," she said. "In St. Mary Mead, a family paid for a cousin's schooling, but they expected silence about their secrets. It's a heavy price." Leonard's face tightened, and he looked away. "You don't know the half of it," he muttered, then stood. "I need to work." He walked off, his notebook clutched tight. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind working. Leonard's words were a clue. He was tied to the family's money, but resentful, maybe trapped. His sketches might show what he couldn't say. She'd have to find a way to see them, but carefully. Back in the house, the family was gathering for lunch. The dining room felt smaller, the air thick with tension. Beatrice tried to keep things light, talking about the weather, but her hands were nervous, twisting her napkin. Edward and Clara sat close, their voices low, their faces tense. Margaret was silent, her eyes on her plate, her anger simmering. Leonard ate quickly, his notebook beside him, his eyes avoiding everyone. Miss Marple watched them, her needles idle. The box, the letters, Victor Crane. They were all tied to Reginald's past, and someone in this room knew it. She decided to try Beatrice again. "This house is so full of history," she said, her voice light. "Did Reginald keep many records? Business papers, maybe?" Beatrice's fork paused, and her eyes flicked to Edward. "He did," she said, her voice tight. "But they're gone now. The study was his private space." "Of course," Miss Marple said, nodding. "In St. Mary Mead, a man's papers once showed he'd been cheated by a partner. Names can hold such power, can't they?" Beatrice's face paled, and she set her fork down. "Names are just names," she said, but her voice shook. Chirtis. Marple didn't push, but her mind was racing. Beatrice's fear, Leonard's resentment, Clara's letter, Edward's worry. It all pointed to Victor Crane and the box. The secret was close, and it was dangerous. After lunch, Miss Marple excused herself to rest, but she went to her room to read the newspaper. The article about Reginald's death was short, but it mentioned Victor Crane again, calling him a survivor of the boating accident. Another line caught her eye. Crane, a known trader, left the area soon after. Trader, Miss Marple thought. Maybe a smuggler, like the one in St. Mary Mead, who hid stolen goods in a boat. She closed the paper, her heart quickening. The box's letters, the ledger, Victor Crane, Reginald's death, they were all linked, and the family was scared. Clara's letter might be from Crane, or about him, and the box held proof of something illegal, something that could ruin the Ashfords. That evening, dinner was quiet, the tension heavier than ever. Beatrice barely spoke, her eyes red. Edward and Clara whispered, their hands touching but their faces worried. Margaret snapped at the maid about the wine. Leonard sketched, his pencil scratching loudly. Miss Marple watched them, her needles clicking softly. The storm was close now, and the box was at its heart. As dessert was served, apple pie with cream, she heard it again. A faint creak from the hall, like careful footsteps. No one else noticed, lost in their own thoughts. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Someone was moving, and they were hiding something. She excused herself early, claiming tiredness, and climbed the stairs, her ears sharp. In the hall she paused, near the library, listening. The creak came again, from inside. She slipped to the door, peering through a crack. A shadow moved, quick and quiet, near the bookshelf where she'd found the box. It was too dark to see who, but they were searching, their hands feeling along the shelves. Miss Marple stepped back, her heart steady. Someone knew the box was there, or suspected it. She returned to her room, locking the door, and sat by the window, her knitting in her lap. The moon was bright, the gardens silver below. The box, the letters, Victor Crane, the creaks, they were all part of the same secret, tied to Reginald's past. Someone was desperate to keep it hidden, and someone else, Clara, maybe, was desperate to reveal it. Her needles clicked, the pink scarf nearly done. The mystery was like that scarf, each clue a stitch, building toward the truth. She didn't know the whole pattern yet, but she was close. Tomorrow she'd talk to Clara, maybe see Leonard's sketches. The shadow of the past was long, but Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, and she would find the light stitch by stitch. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The evening air in Ashford Hall was thick with tension, like a storm about to break. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, her knitting idle in her lap, her sharp eyes fixed on the moonlit gardens below. The clues she'd gathered over the past days, Clara's crumpled letter, the missing box, the scratch marks, the creaks in the night, the name Victor Crane, and the letters in the library, had woven a pattern in her mind. The Ashford family was hiding a secret, one tied to Lord Reginald's past, and tonight she would unravel it. She dressed in her plain grey frock, pinned her grey hat with its single feather, and tucked her notebook into her bag. Her needles clicked once, a steady rhythm, as she prepared for what lay ahead. Downstairs, the drawing-room was warm with firelight, but the mood was cold. The family had gathered after dinner, their faces tight with worry. Lady Beatrice sat on a velvet sofa, her silver hair neat, but her hands twisting a handkerchief. Edward and Clara sat close, their hands linked, but their eyes were heavy, like they carried a shared burden. Margaret stood by the window, her dark hair loose, her arms crossed, her anger simmering. Leonard leaned against a wall, his notebook clutched tight, his dark eyes darting to the floor. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself knew the truth was close. Miss Marple entered quietly, her smile gentle, her knitting bag on her arm. "Good evening," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I hope you don't mind me joining you. I've been thinking about the missing box." Beatrice's hands froze, and her eyes flicked to Edward. "Oh, Jane," she said, her voice shaky. "It's just papers. We're not worried about it." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her needles clicking as she pulled out her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, a missing box once held letters that changed everything, she said, her tone light. Sometimes small things hide big secrets. Margaret's eyes flashed. "What are you getting at?" she snapped. "This is our business, not yours." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her smile kind but her eyes sharp. "But secrets have a way of coming out, like that locked study with its scratch marks, or the box I found in the library with letters and a ledger." The room went still. Beatrice's handkerchief slipped to the floor. Edward's hand tightened on Clara's. Margaret's face paled, and Leonard's notebook shook in his grip. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her calm voice cutting through the silence. "I found the box behind a panel," she said. "Letters from Lord Reginald to Victor Crane, talking about secret deals. A ledger with payments, dated before his death. It seems Reginald's wealth wasn't all from honest work." Beatrice gasped, her hand to her mouth. "Jane, you don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Reginald was a good man. Those papers, they're private." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but firm. "I'm sure he was good in many ways," she said, "but the letters suggest he worked with Victor Crane on something shady, maybe smuggling, and someone took that box to keep it hidden." Margaret stepped forward, her fists clenched. "Are you accusing us?" she demanded. "Clara's the new one here. She's been snooping, hasn't she?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice breaking. "I wouldn't." Edward stood, his face tight. "Stop it, Margaret," he said, his voice sharp. "Clara's done nothing wrong." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked at Clara. "But you know something, don't you, dear?" she said, her tone soft. "That letter in your room, the gay one that made you cry. It's part of this, isn't it?" Clara's face went white, and she clutched Edward's hand. How did you know?" she whispered. She reached into her pocket, her hands shaking, and pulled out a crumpled letter. "I got this a week ago. It's from Victor Crane." The room froze. Beatrice's eyes widened, Margaret's mouth dropped open, and Leonard's notebook slipped to the floor. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. I see it, Clara?" she asked. Clara hesitated, then handed it over, her hands trembling. Miss Marple smoothed the paper, her eyes scanning the words. It was short, written in a sharp, slanted hand. "Pay me what Reginald owed, or I tell the world about his deals. The Ashford name will fall." It was signed Victor Crane. Miss Marple folded the letter, her mind racing. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once found a blackmail note that broke a family apart. This was the same, a threat to ruin the Ashfords unless they paid. She looked at Clara, her voice gentle. "This must have been so frightening," she said. "Did you tell anyone?" Clara nodded, tears spilling. "Just Edward," she said. "I didn't know what to do. I don't want to hurt the family." Edward's face was grim. "I told her to keep it quiet," he said, his voice low. "I knew about Father's deals, some of them, anyway. He told me before he died, said it was a mistake. I thought if we ignored Crane, he'd go away." Beatrice's hands shook, and she sank back onto the sofa. "Oh, Edward," she whispered, "you knew?" Miss Marple's eyes moved to Margaret, who was glaring at Clara. "You brought this on us," Margaret said, her voice sharp. "You and your letter. You're not one of us." "That's enough," Edward snapped, stepping in front of Clara. "This isn't her fault." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her voice calm but firm. "It's not Clara's fault," she said, "but someone took that box to hide the truth, or to use it. Someone knew about Reginald's deals and Crane's threat." Her eyes settled on Leonard, who stood frozen, his notebook on the floor, his face pale. "Leonard," she said, her tone soft but steady. "You've been so quiet. Your sketches see so much, don't they? What do you know?" Leonard's eyes darted to the door, like he wanted to run. "Nothing," he muttered, his voice tight. "I don't know anything." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile kind, but her eyes like needles. "In St. Mary Mead, a young man once hid a secret because he was scared," she said. "But secrets are heavy, Leonard. They weigh you down. What do you know about the box?" Leonard's hands shook, and he sank into a chair, his head bowed. The room was silent, the fire crackling the only sound. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I found the letters years ago," he said, "in the study, before it was locked. They showed what Uncle Reginald did, smuggling with Crane. I used them." Beatrice gasped, her hand to her heart. "Leonard, what do you mean?" she asked, her voice breaking. Leonard's eyes were wet, his voice shaking. "I was in debt," he said. "My paintings don't sell. I needed money, so I told you. I'd show the letters to the papers unless you paid me." "I'm sorry, Aunt Beatrice. I didn't know Crane would come back." Beatrice's face crumpled, and she covered her mouth. "Oh, Leonard," she whispered, "how could you?" Margaret's eyes flashed. "You're a parasite," she spat. "Living here, taking our money, and now this." Edward stepped forward, his face hard. "Why, Leonard?" he asked. "Why? Hurt us?" Leonard's head dropped lower. "I was desperate," he said. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just needed help." Clara's tears fell silently, and she clung to Edward. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her voice gentle. "Desperation makes people do foolish things," she said. "But the truth is out now, Leonard. What did you do with the box?" Leonard swallowed, his voice hoarse. "I hid it in the library," he said. "I thought it was safe there. I didn't know Crane would write to Clara." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the pieces together. Leonard's blackmail had kept the secret alive, and Crane's letter had brought it back. The box, the letters, the ledger. They proved Reginald's crimes, and Crane was using them to threaten the family again. In St. Mary Mead, a blackmailer had once been caught when his victim spoke up. The Ashfords needed to do the same. "Beatrice," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm, "the letters and ledger must go to the police. The truth will hurt, but hiding it will hurt more. Crane won't stop unless you face him." Beatrice's eyes were wet, but she nodded. "You're right, Jane," she said, her voice trembling. "Reginald made mistakes, but he was a good man. I can't keep hiding this." Edward took his mother's hand, his face grim but steady. "We'll do it together," he said. "Clara and I, we want to start clean." Clara nodded, her tears slowing. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was scared, but I want to help." Margaret's anger softened, and she looked at Leonard, her voice quieter. "You're still family," she said, "but you have to make this right." Leonard's head stayed bowed, his voice barely audible. "I will," he said. "I'll pay back what I took. I'll get help." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her smile gentle. "The truth is like a wound," she said. "It hurts at first, but it heals clean. You're a family, and you'll get through this." The room was quiet, the tension easing like a knot untied. Beatrice stood, her face tired but resolute. "And they call the police tomorrow," she said. "We'll give them the box and the letters. No more hiding." Miss Marple nodded, her heart light. The puzzle was solved, the secret out. Victor Crane would face justice, and the Ashfords would face their past. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where truth had healed more than one family. It would heal this one too. As the family talked, their voices softer now, Miss Marple slipped upstairs to her room. The moon was high, the gardens silver below. She sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, the pink scarf nearly done. The creaks in the night were gone, the house quieter, as if it had let out a long-held breath. She thought of Leonard's confession, Clara's letter, Beatrice's fear, and Edward's resolve. Each had played a part, and each had a chance to heal. The shadow of the past was long, but the truth had brought light. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind at peace. Tomorrow she'd pack her bag and return to St. Mary Mead, where new puzzles would surely wait. But tonight she'd rest, knowing she'd helped a family find their way. Chapter 8. The Resolution. The morning sun rose over Ashford Hall, painting the gardens in soft gold. Miss Jane Marple stood by her guest-room window, her knitting in her lap, the pink scarf now complete. The house felt different today. lighter, as if a heavy curtain had been lifted. Last night's confrontation in the drawing-room had unravelled the Ashford family's darkest secret. Lord Reginald's shady dealings with Victor Crane, the missing box of letters and ledger, and Leonard's desperate blackmail. The truth was out, and though it had stung, it was the first step toward healing. Miss Marple's sharp eyes softened as she looked at the roses below. Her work here was nearly done. She dressed in her simple blue frock, pinned her grey hat with its single feather, and packed her small suitcase. Her notebook, filled with neat jottings about Clara's letter, the scratch marks, Victor Crane, and the creaks in the night, went into her knitting bag. She'd solved the puzzle, but not without cost to the Ashfords. Truth, she knew, was like a bitter medicine. It hurt going down, but brought relief in time. In St. Mary Mead, she'd seen families mend after secrets were spilled, and she believed the Ashfords could too. Downstairs, the dining room was quiet, the table set with toast, eggs, and tea. Elsie, the maid, moved quickly, her hands steady, now her eyes less nervous. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, pouring tea. "The family's up, but they're talking things over." "Thank you, Elsie," Miss Marple said, her smile kind. "Big truths can shake a house, can't they? I knew a family in St. Mary Mead who found peace after a secret came out." Elsie nodded, a small smile breaking through. "It's better now, ma'am," she said softly. "They're not hiding any more." She hurried off, her steps lighter. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind noting Elsie's change. Servants felt the weight of secrets too, and Elsie's relief was a sign the family was facing the truth. She spread jam on her toast, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, thinking of last night. Leonard's confession had shocked them all. His blackmail, born of debt and desperation, had kept Reginald's crimes alive. Clara's letter from Victor Crane had brought the past crashing back, threatening to ruin the Ashfords. But Beatrice's, resolved to tell the police, Edward's support, and even Margaret's softened anger showed they could move forward. Lady Beatrice entered, her silver hair neat, but her face tired, with lines deeper than before. "Good morning, Jane," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I hope you slept well after everything." "Quite well," Miss Marple said, her tone warm. "Truth can be like a storm, Beatrice, but it clears the air. How are you holding up?" Beatrice sat, her hands still for once. No handkerchief to twist. "It's hard," she said, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "Reginald's mistakes. I knew a little, but not all of it. I thought locking the study would keep it buried. I was wrong." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she pulled out her knitting. "In St. Mary Mead, a woman once hid her husband's debts, thinking it would protect her children. But truth always finds a way. You're doing the right thing, Beatrice." Beatrice's lips trembled, but she smiled. "Thank you, Jane," she said. "I called the police this morning. They're coming for the box and letters. It's frightening, but it feels right." Miss Marple's heart lifted. Beatrice's courage was a good sign, like the first green shoot after a long winter. "You're strong," she said. "Your family will get through this." Edward and Clara came in next, their hands linked, their faces less tense than before. Edward's smile was genuine, though tired, and Clara's eyes were clearer, like a weight had lifted. "Morning, Miss Marple," Edward said, pulling out Clara's chair. We owe you so much." "Oh, nonsense," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I just helped you see what was already there. You two look stronger today." Clara blushed, her hand squeezing Edward's. "We talked all night," she said. "We're going to delay the wedding, just until things settle. But we're together, and that's what matters." Edward nodded, his eyes warm. "The father made mistakes," he said, "but we won't hide them any more. Clara and I want a fresh start." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind noting their resolve. In St. Mary Mead, a young couple had once rebuilt their lives after a scandal, and she saw the same strength in Edward and Clara. "A fresh start is a fine thing," she said. "Love and truth make a strong foundation." Margaret entered, her dark hair tied back, her face still sharp but softer than before. She sat without her usual storm, her eyes flicking to Clara. "Morning," she muttered, grabbing a piece of her toast. She didn't snap or glare, and Miss Marple saw it as a small victory. "Good morning, Margaret," Miss Marple said, her tone kind. "You must be glad the party's over. Big events can stir up so much." Margaret nodded, her lips tight, but not angry. "Yeah," she said, "too much drama, but it's better now." She glanced at Clara, then away, like she was trying to make peace. Miss Marple smiled, her needles moving. Margaret's anger was cooling, and that was progress. Families, she knew, could heal if they faced the truth together. Leonard was last, his dark hair messy, his notebook gone for once. He sat at the far end, his eyes on his plate, his shoulders slumped. "Morning," he mumbled, barely looking up. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Good morning, Leonard," she said. "You've been through a lot. In St. Mary Mead, a young man once made a mistake, but found his way back by making it right." Leonard's eyes flicked to her, wet with shame. "I'm going to try," he said, his voice low. "I'll pay Aunt Beatrice back. I'll get help for my debts." Beatrice reached across the table, her hand touching his. "Your family, Leonard," she said, her voice soft. "We'll help you." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she didn't snap. Edward nodded, his face serious but kind. Clara smiled at Leonard, her eyes forgiving. Miss Marple's heart warmed. The Ashfords were bruised, but they were mending, like a torn scarf stitched back together. Breakfast was quiet, the family eating with less tension than before. Beatrice spoke of plans to clean the ballroom. Edward and Clara talked about their delayed wedding. Margaret mentioned a new book she was reading, and Leonard ate silently, his face still heavy, but his eyes softer. Miss Marple watched them, her needles clicking, her mind at peace. The puzzle was solved, and the family was finding their way. After breakfast, Beatrice asked Miss Marple to join her in the garden. "I need to thank you properly," she said, leading the way to the roses. The air was crisp, the flowers bright, despite the autumn chill. Beatrice's steps were slow, her face tired but calm. "You've saved us, Jane," Beatrice said, her voice steady. "We were drowning in that secret, and you pulled us out." Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag on her arm. "I only helped you see the truth," she said. "Families are strong when they face things together. In St. Mary Mead, a family once healed after a scandal because they didn't hide any more." Beatrice nodded, her eyes wet. "Reginald would have wanted this," she said. "He made mistakes, but he loved us. I'll make sure his good work, his real work, lives on. You will, Miss Marple said, her tone warm, and your children will carry it forward. They walked in silence for a moment, the roses glowing in the sunlight. Miss Marple thought of the box, now waiting for the police, and the letters that would expose Victor Crane. The Ashford name might take a hit, but it would survive, stronger for the truth. Back in the house, Miss Marple found Clara in the library, looking at the bookshelf where the box had been hidden. "I was scared," Clara said, turning to her. "That letter. I thought it would ruin everything." Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile kind. "Fear makes secrets grow," she said. "But you were brave, Clara. You and Edward will be fine." Clara's eyes shone, and she hugged Miss Marple, a quick, shy gesture. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're like an angel." Miss Marple laughed softly. "Just an old lady who notices things," she said, her eyes twinkling. She found Edward in the drawing room, writing a letter. "It's to the police," he said, looking up. "I'm telling them everything I know about Father's deals. It's hard, but it's right." "You're doing well," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "Truth is the best start for a new life." Edward smiled, his face lighter. "Clara and I will make it," he said, "thanks to you." Miss Marple nodded, her heart light. She moved to the hall, where Margaret was arranging flowers. "They're finally right," Margaret said, her voice gruff but not angry. "No more lilies." "They're lovely," Miss Marple said, smiling. "You've got a good eye, Margaret. Families need that, someone to see things clearly." Margaret's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Maybe," she said, turning back to the flowers. Leonard was in the garden, sitting on a bench, his notebook open but his pencil still. Miss Marple sat beside him, her knitting in her lap. "You're starting over," she said, her tone kind. "That's brave, Leonard." He looked at her, his eyes wet. "I messed up," he said, "but I'll fix it. I owe them that." "You do," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "And you will. In St. Mary Mead, a young man once turned his life around after a mistake. You can too." Leonard nodded, his face resolute. "I'll try," he said, picking up his pencil. Miss Marple returned to her room to finish packing. Her suitcase was small, holding just her dresses, cardigan and knitting. She tucked the pink scarf into it, a gift for her niece in St. Mary, Mead. The house was quieter now, the creaks gone, the shadows lighter. The Ashfords were healing, and she was ready to go home. Robert, the driver, was waiting with the car, his serious face softer today. "You did good here, ma'am," he said as he took her suitcase. "The house feels different." Miss Marple smiled, settling into the back seat. "Truth changes things," she said. "It's like sunlight on a dark day." The car pulled down, the long drive, Ashford Hall shrinking behind her. She thought of Beatrice's courage, Edward and Clara's love, Margaret's softening, and Leonard's resolve. The secret, Reginald's smuggling, Victor Crane's threats, the box of letters had nearly broken them, but truth had set them free. As they drove through the countryside, Miss Marple's mind wandered to St. Mary Mead. There, secrets hid, in quiet cottages and church halls, just as they did in grand mansions. People were the same everywhere, she thought, full of hopes and fears, mistakes and dreams. Her needles would wait in her bag, ready for the next puzzle, because there was always another. The car slowed as they neared her cottage, its garden neat with dahlias. Tom, the postman, waved from his bicycle, his whistle cheerful. "Welcome back, Miss Marple," he called. "Thank you, Tom," she said, stepping out. The air smelled of home, grass and flowers, simple and clean. She carried her suitcase inside, her heart light. The pink scarf would go to her niece, and the notebook would stay in her bag, its pages full of this mystery's lessons. She sat by the window, her knitting out again, starting a new project, a blue shawl this time. The village was quiet, but Miss Marple knew it wouldn't stay that way. Secrets always came, like clouds before rain, and she'd be ready, her sharp eyes and gentle ways unravelling them, stitch by stitch.